Life, a miracle in the universe, appeared around 4 billion years ago. And we humans, only 200,000 years ago. Yet we have succeeded in disrupting the balance that is so essential to life. In 50 years, in a single lifetime, the Earth has been more radically changed than by all previous generations of humanity. We know that the solutions are there today. We all have the power to change. So what are we waiting for?
Previously, I just did not believe. I think I didn't even think about it at the time, but basically I had just shut right off and had no hope, and politics was like a dirty word to me, and I just didn't invest in any of it, and I just figured that what's the point? And so I didn't subscribe, didn't educate, didn't vote, didn't anything.
How much do people watch the House of Commons?
Well, I don't know that people, I mean, well, I have to say I'm surprised how many people do watch CPAC, because I run into people all the time. So I saw you the other night on that emergency debate. I loved what you had to say about, you know, whatever. It's not about who watches it. It's about the respect for our institutions and the understanding of what kind of system of government we have. We are not a presidential system, no matter how much Stephen Harper has, and not just Stephen Harper, before him, a whole series of prime ministers have continually accumulated powers unto themselves, and the prime minister who follows consolidates that power and expands it. So it's become extremely dangerous for Canadian democracy to fail to understand that in a Canadian election, we do not elect a prime minister.
Bonjour et toutes et tous. My name is Suzanne Morton, and I am the acting director of the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada. I'd like to welcome you all here today to the J.R. Mallory Lecture in Canadian Studies. We're particularly pleased to have Elizabeth May delivering a lecture, The Crisis in Democracy.
The day Harper, Layton, and Duceppe announced their deal to bring down the government of Paul Martin was the opening day of the 11th Conference of the Parties on the Kyoto Protocol, hosted by Canada in the person of Stéphane Dion, here in Montreal. It was a key meeting, being the first by the ratifying parties under the protocol. Their timing was just right to push what might seem to have been a liberal coup on the environment off the front pages. And in the campaign that followed, the NDP abandoned its support for action to reduce climate change, sidestepping the issue and focusing instead on the sponsorship scandal. Harper, of course, won a minority, and Canada withdrew Canada's support for Kyoto.
Suddenly I have young kids at home, and suddenly I'm thinking about what this future we are creating will be, and I have a much more of an investment. And then I see these women doing their work, and I think, wow.
In 2006, Stephen Harper and the Conservatives had the minority of seats, but they had more seats than the Liberals, which were the next party at that time. They were the official, Liberals were official opposition. The Conservatives had a minority. But at any time, the Liberals and the New Democrats could have decided to work together, and Stephen Harper would have been opposition. Because we elect a parliament, we don't elect a prime minister.
And anybody who stands up and says, I'm running for prime minister, has just sort of bastardized our whole system through a foolishness. We are, each of us as MPs, running to be a member of parliament. And then when we assemble in the House of Commons, if it wasn't for the existence of political parties, we could choose who among us should be prime minister.
I think that one of the most remarkable things about Elizabeth May is her unquenchable optimism. But as Elizabeth does not go overboard in her criticisms, she manages to stay level-headed and focus on how things can be improved. Almost always, that recipe involves all of us. As I have been known to say, democracy is not a right but a duty. Or, as she has written, making a democracy work requires effective citizenship. It is not enough to vote every few years. It is not even enough to send a check now and then to an environmental or anti-poverty group. Making democracy work is work.
This is hard for me to say out loud because it sounds like I don't know. I'm very, very committed to never becoming a politician. I don't want to ever be the kind of person who brags. I find it obnoxious. But the reality is that off camera, most journalists regard what I'm doing as real work that they take seriously. So I'm taken very seriously by other parliamentarians and by journalists. I feed them a lot of their stories. I dig stuff up, and sometimes it's stuff I can't use yet in Parliament.
I don't know whether Canadians are watching Parliament or not, but what matters as an MP is to do the work for my constituents, to hold the executive to account, to root out the information, and to try to create the kind of atmosphere where we can work together cooperatively, which, as I talk about in the book, I saw day to day happening in the 80s when I worked for the Minister of Environment when Brian Mulroney was Prime Minister. It wasn't that long ago that the Canadian Parliament functioned without the toxic levels of hyperpartisanship we see today.
But as I've done in a number of my books, I want to make it clear that what we're seeing here are trends, and trends that are dangerous. A lot of how I feel about what's happening to democracy, all those years that Charles and I worked together, in the environmental movement, even going back to Nova Scotia trying to fight bloodworm spraying, we had a government that listened. Like, How to Save the World in Your Spare Time is a guidebook for activists of how to organize and mobilize to get elected decision makers to listen to you and to a movement and to respond appropriately. It's a primer in citizen effectiveness. It's, do your research, put together the case, you mobilize your case, you talk to the public, you do a media campaign, you go to an elected official, and they will listen when they realize both that you've figured out the alternatives, that your case makes sense, and that you have a lot of Canadians behind you that could affect the electoral results, right? That's not true anymore. None of it's true anymore. It's like a Monty Python sketch of the dead parrot. Democracy is nailed to its little perch. When Kevin Page was speaking on Salt Spring, he cited a lyric from Bruce Cockburn, with which I was not familiar. It's awfully good. It's from 1981. And Kevin Page said, well, as Bruce Cockburn says, the trouble with normal is it always gets worse. So here's what's becoming normal in Canada. When I left Sierra Club to run for leader of the Green Party, it was from that situation that Charles describes, taking us back to November 28th, 2005, when the COP11 opened in Montreal, the government fell, we were into an election campaign, and the fact that COP11 succeeded in keeping Kyoto on track, in defeating the Bush administration, and getting a viable climate plan going. It was all ashes in our mouth by the end of January when Stephen Harper became Prime Minister and immediately, or virtually immediately, announced that Canada was repudiating our Kyoto targets. Canada's behavior on climate, by the way, is far worse than the measure of our tonnage of emissions. It's what we have done globally to sabotage progress internationally that is our largest offense. It's in fact criminal. But when I go back to that moment of November 28th, 2005, that was the moment when I began to think, oh boy, we could be in real trouble in this country. Finding that fewer than 60% of Canadians were voting, as in the 2008 election. The use of attack ads. I describe attack ads in this book as a tool of voter suppression. The only reason that parties spend money on attack ads is to disgust the voting public enough that we hope they might not vote. That's what a political party that spends money on attack ads is hoping, that you won't vote. And it's described, in the literature of the current how to win elections without actually winning the hearts and minds of the electorate. Voter suppression is a key tool, and it's accepted by people who do this kind of barbarism for a living. People who don't actually believe in democracy, but think they know how to win elections. I was doing an interview with Michael Enright on the CBC Sunday Morningside program,
And his other guest was one of my favorite journalists who cared about these issues, the late James Travers. And I'd known Jim Travers from when he'd been on the editorial board of the Ottawa Citizen. We were old friends, but here we were in this setting, me in one studio and him in another. And Michael Enright said, okay, Elizabeth, why do you say there's a crisis? Isn't that overblown rhetoric? What crisis in Canadian democracy? I spelled out some of the things I've just mentioned to you. I think I may have thrown in that the RCMP interfered in the 2008 election and no one seemed to care that the state police had actually thrown the election to a party that they liked. Didn't seem to get many people upset. And then Michael Enright turned to James Travers and said, well, Jim, is she exaggerating? Is there a crisis in Canadian democracy? And I'm paraphrasing because I don't have a tape of this, but Jim Travers said, oh, no, not at all. As a matter of fact, I think she's understating the case. He said, oh, you can still visit Ottawa these days. And what you'll find is a democracy theme park. All the buildings are there and you can tour them, and it might create the impression that democracy is going on, but I assure you it isn't.
And all of a sudden, it's not politics. You know, I don't know a lot about it, but I suddenly want to learn more. But most of all, I just want to follow the people who I think are going to change the world.
And as luck would have it, Joanne Roberts in Victoria, Frances Littman of Squamish Sandwich Soup, Fran Hunt Janucci in Cowichan, Malahat, Langford, Lynn Corby, Burnaby, North Seymour, the for North Vancouver, you don't know yet. It's really quite possible that when the election is over, we'll have a caucus that'll be the first time in Canadian history with more women than men. Which I think will at least be interesting. Anyway, I'm deeply grateful for all your help. I'd just like to share the news from out there, because Sandwich Gulf Islands is ground zero for the growth of green strength. But that green strength here has got to spill over and carry across Vancouver Island and into the Lower Mainland and sweep its way all the way up into some ridings in Ontario, Quebec, and Maritimes. So that we have what we really need in this country, which is a strong caucus of members of Parliament more committed to the country than to short-term partisanship, and more committed to the planet than anything else, committed to work for their constituents, and committing to do politics differently.
It's super exciting, and I think that I really do believe that we're right now. Like, people are stirring, and people are unhappy, and people are being called forward to what, you know, the voices that are speaking, like Elizabeth's and Frances's, and, you know, so it makes me think maybe politics are cool, and maybe I have a hope that this world is changing the way we want it to.
I'm just going to say that this is not about separate groups fighting separate ways. We are a movement, we are a community, and we come together. And we need to remember not to allow ourselves to be captured by movements that are fear-based. We have to remember to move forward, not just for the fight to get rid of Stephen Harper, but for the clear knowledge, which I hold in my heart and in my mind, that 2015 is the year that the Harper era ends. And in that knowledge, prepare yourself not just for a fight, but prepare yourself for dancing. Thank you. I'll never forget the first day I read C-38, which was the day of first reading, and coming finally to the last section of the section on environmental review, the last subsection of that part of the Omnibus Bill that said the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act is repealed. Because I kept reading this thing and thinking, this makes no sense. How could this work? Well, they can't do that because... And then you come to the last. So I have in mind, and I hope you'll forgive me for what this is going to look like. Because I'm going to go into the territory of what the world is going to look like, what Canada will look like by October 20th. And it'll be a very different place with, I think it'll be a minority parliament with enough of us, I hope a lot of Greens elected. I'm not partisan about this, I swear, I promised you I'm not. I just want enough people who are smart, who will work with anybody. And at this point, that means us. So there's going to have to be a lot of us. The people in other parties are smart, but they just keep doing this. So we need to be able to be there together and make sure that we have a cooperative, greenish new government. And then what we're going to do, forgive me, is going to be an omnibus bill. And the omnibus bill country, we always have been, only better. Equipped for the 21st century, where we move off fossil fuels, we're not stupid enough to think it makes sense to ship out raw bitumen. We stop shipping out raw logs. We start investing in local jobs. We make this country so prosperous that our kids don't have to worry about whether they can afford to go to university. We put back everything the way it belongs, and we do it in partnership through reconciliation with the leadership of First Nations in this country. Yes. This is what 2015 is going to do, and we won't have to worry that Kinder Morgan's going to get one single more Aframax tankers in the Salish Sea. We and the orcas and the wild salmon and the grizzlies, we live here, they don't. Thank you.